Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I know that momentum is gathering for us to begin at exactly 10 a.m. this morning. Thank you very much for joining us for this, the third chapter in the BDO Clarity sessions. We're going to start promptly at the top of the hour. And we have an amazing program set up for you, and we would love for you to interact throughout the course of the program. You'll see in your live stream that you have access to the polls. Post your questions there, and the more the questions are liked, the higher up they will appear, and I'll be able to pose them to our panelists. This is such an exciting conversation that I can't wait to host with you, so don't move. Hi again. If you've just joined us, we're counting down and looking forward excitedly to the start of our third BDO Clarity session at 10 a.m. Please do invite your family and friends. It's not just for a limited audience. In fact, as widely as we can get the word out as possible, the better for us. And just want to let you know that BDO, as our hosts today, is also the winner of the 2020 Global Dreamcatcher Award. And their South African operation, by the way, is noted in their among their global operations for implementing some of these strategic interventions to its clients during the pandemic. So certainly a lot of praiseworthy attempts BDO will have us be aware of in terms of the way their operations are working here and how agile they are in responding to the changing needs of working within a global pandemic. So again, get your coffee cups ready. We are going to begin shortly.
BDO is not just a building. We're not just a location, a logo, or an address, and we're not just a service provider. We don't just do auditing, tax, and advisory. We're much more ambitious than that. We've built our reputation by playing our role in changing a profession in crisis, by helping to bring direction and certainty, and build trust among our people, peers, clients, and regulators. We kicked this off with the launch of our Clarity Charter in 2020, a public commitment to not only uphold ethics and professionalism, but to do better in our approach to doing business. Clarity means we are clear and unambiguous about where we can add value, how we behave, not only as advisors, but as citizens of South Africa, our industry sector knowledge, and where we can innovate, and what a responsible firm looks like. It means we don't hide from uncomfortable conversations, and we invite everyone to hold us to account on this, even as we hold the profession to account.
Good morning. Good morning. It is so wonderful to be with you today. My name is Iman Rapetti. I'm a broadcaster and author, and it is my pleasure to host this discussion on behalf of BDO, as you heard there in the opening video, the third in their Clarity Session series. And I think what's important is that it's intended to cement commitment towards driving clarity, especially in this economy, and some would say we need it now more than ever. So it doesn't matter where you're joining us from, if you are lying in bed with your onesie and your cup of coffee in hand, or if you're at the boardroom in the office already, it is wonderful to have you with us. This is an important conversation. And I think just looking at the caliber of guests that we have, it's going to be invigorating, and it's going to give you exactly what you need to create context for some of the important data, the information that was shared with the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni yesterday, the direction in which South Africa is going. And so we certainly have our work cut out for us in about an hour or so, and I think that we are certainly up to the challenge. As always in these sessions, we want to hear from you. We want you to be a part of our conversation. So I understand that the majority of our guests are joining us via the live stream. So it's really, really easy. All you have to do is register for the poll. We have some poll questions that we'd like you to interact with. We will also have a Q&A function on the app itself, so that you can share your questions. And the more you like a particular question, the higher up it goes, and the more it gives me an opportunity to ask those questions. As an opener, and you can probably see on your screen what the poll looks like, how much personal income tax contributes to South Africa's tax revenue? And you have three options there, the 38%, 27%, or 15%. I just want to tell you a little bit of an inside joke. We thought of asking a light question. In other words, what do tax officials and tax professionals wear to the office every day? We didn't quite get there because we couldn't figure it out. I mean, I think a lot of us are also working from home. So there you have it. There's our question. We'd love for you to interact with it and also to share your questions on that platform. Okay, so that housekeeping aside, as I was mentioning, we are in a very specific context of chaos in our economy, some would say, crisis in our economy, some would say. And so this moment for clarity couldn't have come at a better time for us. And if I had to characterize yesterday's budget address, it would be about trampolines and hope. We're looking at a global economic rebound, which the FM was telling us about, of around 5.5% before moderating to about 4.2% in 2020. In South Africa, we're chasing 3.3%. Is it possible, given all of the interventions and the policy direction that the Treasury and the Finance Minister is taking us in? Just this morning, I was talking to Labour. I spoke to the president of COSATU, who was talking about it not being Labour-friendly, and we know the travails that are happening there with the public wage bill. And then you speak to the DG of Treasury, who says this is absolutely a budget of balance, 56% in fact going towards a people-skewed and people-friendly budget. It's not up to me to say whether he was right or wrong and who is right or wrong. It's up to our panel to help us understand these figures in a bigger context of macroeconomic stability and also what it means just for everyday businesses and families in our country at the end, because corporations do not exist in a vacuum. So let us then welcome our panel, and a lot of them I've had the pleasure of interacting with, so it's a wonderful meeting up again of friends. And if you're astounded that they're all sitting next to each other in a context of COVID, where we have so much mask and social distancing awareness, I just want to let you know that this is how far our technology has come. It places us all in the same room, rubbing shoulders with each other as if we were right there together when we're not. So every panelist that you are seeing is coming from their own spaces from across the country. So don't be alarmed and do not pick up that phone to Bekele. I want to introduce them to you one by one, everyone looking really great, and I'm not sure if it's because of the news we heard in the budget yesterday. But let us start with Busisiwe Mavuso, who's the CEO of Business Leadership in South Africa. She, as you all know, and you've heard from her often, she's a certified chartered accountant with the Association of Certified Chartered Accountants. She holds a master's degree in business leadership, a postgrad qualification in management from Gibbs, a slew of other accolades and accomplishments, but she is the CEO at Business Leadership South Africa. It's an important association of business leaders in South Africa. Next to Busi on her left is Kevin Lings, who's chief economist at Stanlib. And over the past 10 years, and I've also had the privilege of interacting with Kevin over the years, his research and his economic research has broadened to include the G3 economies as well as members of BRICS. And his research is largely used to inform Stanlib's asset management investment process. And I love his philosophy. I concur. Everything should be made as simple as possible. Chieta Madzima as well, also to Kevin's left, in the news a lot these days, head of South Africa Risk and Operational Research for Fitch Solutions. And her areas of specialization are what she is really going to be drawn upon today in this conversation: in business environment analysis, policy risk, and macro data analytics, focusing on emerging markets. So it is wonderful to have you as well with us. And then to, just to the left of me on your screen is Professor David Wanica, and our host today, the head of technical tax at BDO, and he heads up BDO's tax consulting division in the Western Cape. Also adjunct professor in tax at the University of Cape Town and chair of SAICA's National Tax Committee and a member of the Tax Court. And all of our guests together have many, many years of experience. The other thing I want to say is, often in these fora, you feel a little bit discombobulated from people, and so that kind of intimacy of connection and being able to ask questions is lost. But I want us to have a really frank conversation, a really useful conversation today, really relaxed conversation most of all. And I would love, again, if you're just joining us, to interact with the polls and the Q&A. So without further ado, I think let's kick off. As I was sharing with our panelists, depending on who you ask, this budget was not something. It was not a people's budget, not a Labour budget. It was a business-focused budget. So I want to pose this question to each of our guests around the sentiment that surrounds this budget right now, and for them, what their overall sort of assessment of this budget has been. One of the most important, as it's being hailed in South Africa's recent history. And I think that I would love to start with Busisiwe Mavuso. You go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Iman, and I'm looking forward to this meaningful conversation. So I think all in all, Iman, the budget was a very positive one, which is signaling some improvements in government finances. And I think that is definitely the news that we wanted to see, and that is definitely what we wanted to hear as a country, as a world, and everyone who actually has an interest in South Africa Inc. at the moment. So I was very glad, Iman, not to see a tax hike, because I think, let's agree, that a tax hike would not have been a solution at the moment. Let's agree that fiscal consolidation that continues to be elusive in this country can never be achieved through tax hikes. We actually need to focus on how we actually deal with our expenditure containment. And I think the minister really tried to pull a rabbit out of the hat in as far as that is concerned. So some surprising positives, definitely on the tax front. in the form of the reduction in corporate taxes to 27%. I think I was particularly pleased not to see an increase in personal income tax, because let's agree that in terms of where we find ourselves as an economy, where so many people have lost their jobs. I mean, just the other day we saw stats from the Stats SA, which is actually showing that 43% unemployment is where we're sitting at, in terms of the expanded definition in South Africa. And we know a lot of employees in this country, due to the COVID crisis, have actually had to take reduced salaries, and a lot of them are actually on short time. So I think the tax relief, as modest as it is going to go a long way in terms of ensuring that we can stimulate economic recovery, because I guess let's agree that the economic recovery will be stimulated by consumer spending. And I think the relief from the corporate tax perspective is therefore going to allow companies to actually probably can invest more. So I think those positives were definitely welcome. And of course, there are some challenges that the minister has had to navigate. And I think there are concerns as well. I think I worry about the 3.3%, Iman, as you have just alluded, real GDP growth by 2021. I don't know to what extent this is going to be achievable, especially when the projected decline in revenues as a percentage of GDP, has actually been signaled by the minister. So I worry, to what extent, the declining revenues and the 3.3% GDP growth in 2021 is commensurate with everything that we have promised, especially on the Operation Vulindlela Trust. I was particularly pleased to see the big emphasis, Iman, on Operation Vulindlela, because let's agree, that central to our economic recovery as a country is structural reforms. And until and unless we can actually implement structural reforms meaningfully, so until and unless we can actually crowd in the private sector, then the issue of economic recovery is going to continue to be elusive. Everything else that we're doing are short-term interventions, but at some point there's going to have to be a critical focus in terms of to what extent do we implement the long-term interventions to can achieve a sustainable economic growth.
And we'll come back to that characterization, Busi, and thank you very much for that succinct analysis. That characterization of whether chasing 3.3% would be akin to hunting unicorns in this economy, because we need to sing as one in a symphony. But if there's one off-key note, we can't achieve that. I like the way Chietza puts it, that there are a number of pain points as opposed to pressure points, pain points in our economy. And from your purview, Chietza, what are some of these interrelated risk areas that are weighing really heavily on South Africa's growth prospects?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and looking forward to the discussions that we will have this morning. In terms of the interrelated risks that the country is facing, we're looking at energy sector risks, labor market risks, as well as the very slow pace of reform implementation. And this also ties or goes hand in hand with risks towards sort of public procurement policies. So firstly, on the energy front, we believe that, rather substantive reforms to sort of state-owned enterprises, when you look at Eskom as well as sort of other state-owned enterprises, is quite key in terms of driving sort of longer-term economic growth. At the same time, there has been quite a considerable focus on driving renewables investment over the medium to long term. So we're quite positive on this front. And I think if we are looking at a sort of medium to long-term perspective, driving renewables investment is only half the task. As we know, with sort of solar and wind energy, generating it is half the job done. And the other area that needs to be looked at is storing this energy. So I think South Africa does need sort of substantial policy movement on the front of sort of upstream gas development. There's quite considerable potential when you look at the potential for blue and green hydrogen projects. But again, investment will likely stall on the basis of, sort of lags in moving policy along, especially in the upstream gas sector. When we look at the sort of broad sort of pro-business reform picture, I think businesses want to see a more cogent and coherent move towards the government introducing policies that encourage end-to-end sort of enhancements of value chains in the country. And in this regard, we believe that, especially when it comes to public procurement, there's an opportunity to further streamline and digitize public procurement processes to encourage transparency, as well as to encourage the participation of small and medium-sized enterprises. For example, in Mexico, we've seen with the introduction of an e-procurement system, SMEs have been able to participate a lot more, in fact, 20% above government targets. And then finally, on labor market risk, we believe that in order to address the unemployment challenges, there have to be more substantive efforts, rather, to drive skills development, especially on the job skills attainment, as well as reforming the country's labor market regulations. At present, in our Fitch Solutions Operational Risk Index, South Africa ranks 155th out of 201 states worldwide for the flexibility of labor market regulations. So this broadly reflects the kind of rigid wage determination structures, the power of labor market unions in the country, as well as sort of very complex sort of severance pay package requirements, etc. So that does put South Africa on a significant back foot when you look at these three key areas in terms of the pace of reform implementation, energy sector development, as well as labor market risks.
Thank you, Chieta. I want to turn it over to you, Kevin, just on the issue of sentiment and what South Africa's picture is looking like. Chieta mentioned a number of opportunity areas there for us, to ease regulations, to make it easier to do business. What makes us, in this moment where we need it the most, going back to the notion of sentiment, a more investor-friendly destination, even during these constrained times?
Hi, man. Thanks a lot, and morning to everyone. Look, I think broadly the budget to me was more positive than what we anticipated. I would just quickly flag three areas. The fact that there weren't tax hikes or meaningful tax increases, you would say that was positive. The second, I guess, is that government is trying to be disciplined, particularly when it comes to salaries. Obviously, we've got to see whether that can be implemented, but I would say on the whole, that is definitely positive. And the third factor is that government's in a position now to reduce its weekly borrowing requirement. And I think that's market friendly. And we certainly saw markets react a little bit positive towards the budget. So to me, those items were better than expected. And I think the overall tone of the budget was better than expected. Where I think there is a concern, and a very significant concern, is that we just don't have focus on exactly what you mentioned, on fixed investment, on economic growth, on job creation. The real things that we need in this country in order to increase the tax base, in order to ensure that we have sufficient tax revenue going forward. So it feels to me as if the minister's dealing with the immediate issues, and that's fine. But what about the issues over the next couple of years with regards to investor sentiment, with regards to infrastructure development, with regards to job creation? I thought that there was a massive gap. And that gap is reflected actually in the GDP forecast that the minister put forward. So when you break down our GDP forecast that the minister's saying, yes, this year he's got 3.3% growth. And I actually think that that is achievable. It's obviously higher than we've had in recent years, but because we're off such a low base from last year, I do think the 3.3% is achievable. Where to me there's a much bigger concern is that in his forecast, he only has 2.2% for next year, and then 1.6% in the third year. So the minister is telling us that he actually doesn't have confidence that these measures that are being introduced now are going to lead to a much higher growth outcome. Yet when you look at the budget, it does focus, or it does claim to focus, on infrastructure, on investment, on trying to encourage the business sector. But clearly the minister doesn't believe that himself, because he's putting in a very low growth outcome. And what I can be fairly clear on is that if the minister's right and we only grow at 1.6% in 2 years' time, then we're going to have another fiscal crisis. We're simply not going to raise enough tax revenue to deal with all of the expenses that are building up in the background. So I think on the face of it, a good budget. It dealt with the immediate issues right now, and I'm not suggesting that wasn't challenging, very challenging. But we've also got to start to focus very clearly on, so how the hell do we grow this country? Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's enough attention there at all, despite the myriad of economic policy plans that government have put on the table.
Yeah, and in GDP terms, I mean, it's chasmic, the difference between the 3.3% and the 7% contraction from last year. That's the low base that you're talking about. And if we add them all up, and I'm not an economist, so please do correct me, because we want to create clarity here. But, you know, if you add it up in terms of those projections over the next few years, it's almost like saying we'll be back where we were last year. I'm wondering if the billions, I think it was 12.6 billion allocated towards job creation, around 700,000 jobs that we're hoping to create in this economy, is going to also shore up our opportunities there. But we've seen job projections before that don't quite materialize in the way that they ought to, neither with the, partnering economic benefit, where people get to earn a salary and play a role in this economy meaningfully. David, I want to turn it over to you as well. I know that one of the big issues for you going in is naturally going to be around tax. And some of the big focuses were on personal income tax, but also corporate tax. And we heard there down to 27%, which kicks in 2022. Maybe just give us your snapshot view and your analysis from that perspective.
Good morning, Iman, and to all the viewers and the fellow panelists. Yeah, I think there was quite a lot from a tax point of view to be pleased about with this budget. I think it was a very positive thing that we didn't see increases in tax, and especially personal income tax, because South Africa is one of the highest taxed countries in terms of personal income tax burden in the world, and certainly amongst our peers. So I think very positive to see. We've got a small tax base here, personal income taxpayers of around 300,000 or so, that actually bear 40% roughly of the personal income tax total take in the country. So that's quite a worrying statistic, and then does need to be a big broadening of that and a focus on that over time. I was also pleased to see that there is a move towards a reduction in the corporate income tax rate, which is also very high by comparison with our trading partners and competitors in the African environment for investment. So it's good to see that that's come, albeit only by 1 percentage point, but there is obvious trade-off between reducing those corporate tax rates and also reducing personal tax rates, because otherwise there's arbitrage. So it's a move in the right direction, and hopefully we'll see that in years to come going down even further. And that is on the basis of it being tax neutral, revenue neutral, in the sense that there's meant to be a broadening of the corporate tax base. And we saw in last year's budget that there were proposals whereby companies would be limited with regard to the deductions that they could get for interest, and that's yet to be finalized. But I think that's welcome that that will be able to pay for that, as well as not being able to fully utilize the set-off of assessed losses brought forward. There's got to be a payment for that, and I think it's positive that the base is broadened from that perspective. Also think very positive that there's been 3 billion invested in SARS to beef up its artificial intelligence and also its technology to hopefully be able to bridge the tax gap, which I think most of us believe is quite high in this country. And one sees estimates of that ranging anywhere up to 200 billion rand. So I think that's very positive, to try and get everybody to pay their fair share of tax in the country, which would be positive going forward. But I am concerned about how achievable this budget is. I'm concerned about the revenue, and I know that it is coming off a fairly low base. But it does seem to me that, that it's conditional on how many more lockdowns we might have. You've started with the vaccine rollout. At the current, I think, it's not maybe always realized, at the current rate of, let's say, 40,000 vaccinations per week, that needs to be beefed up substantially. I just hope we've got the capacity for that, because at 40,000 vaccinations per week, it would actually take 20 years to vaccinate 2/3 of the population, right? So we need, to beef that up very substantially. Worried about Eskom with load shedding, so that's also a possible impediment. And like Kevin, I'm worried on the expenditure side in terms of whether that public sector wage bill negotiation is going to lead to a zero increase for 3 years. So I think there are risks with regard to whether this budget is achievable or not. I certainly one hopes it is achievable, but it does seem to be quite an optimistic budget from that perspective.
But it happens again, and David, thank you for that assessment. It happens in a very specific context in South Africa. And I'm wondering also, and this is something you can all just put in your margins really quickly, and you can reference it later on, is how do you plan for the long term in a context of uncertainty, where you're building or you're driving on a road that you are constructing in motion? And that for me, just as an ordinary person, is an enduring question. But two tenets of what you just said, David, around labor and around the beefing up of, or at least the allocation of that 3.3 billion to SARS. I was in conversation with the Commissioner this morning, Edward Kisvetter, around what that is able to unlock. And we know that it's wide ranging, because South Africans are like, what about the rich people? What about illicit tax flows? The loopholes in the law that still make it legal for you to take out money, but unethical and immoral for companies to do so. So they're wanting to beef up the laws. They're wanting to use this money, again, as you say, to manage their investigative capacities in a real way. And the figure that he shared with me this morning was around 100 billion rand that could be unlocked. And that is a massive amount of money. So it's something we have to take seriously. But what I'm concerned about, and we'll come back to this question, is in a context where massive trade unions in South Africa are saying, despite us being in this alliance, what the finance minister said yesterday is tantamount to calling a moratorium or a stoppage of collective bargaining, and there is no way that Labour in this country is not going to push back on that, and that is certainly going to have an impact on any kind of planning that we make and that we intend to embark upon if Labour is not on board with the journey. So let's just all take a breath for just a moment, except me, because I've got to tell our listeners and our participants, of course, about the poll. So let me go there really quickly. I just want to have a look at whether there are any poll questions coming through, and just to remind everyone that you can take part in our polls. You can ask anything you want that, of course, is related to the subject matter at hand. And the more that others like these, the higher up in the hierarchy of questions they will go, and I'll pose them to our panelists. But I also want to say to those of you who are joining us on YouTube, please go over to the link that you received in your invitation, so that you can be in the right forum and you can also participate with the interactive discussion portion. So I'd like to encourage you and invite you to do that. So let's look at this question. Taking into consideration the drain that SOEs place on our limited resources, and that the minister was completely silent on this, what is your rating of the budget from 1 to 5? That's a question that we have posed to all of you, and the numbers were excellent. On the extreme end of the scale, 1%. The majority of our participants saying that this was it was average. 57% of our participants saying that this was average, and this was 103 people participating in this particular question. So thank you very much for that. I'd love to see if those slides adjust themselves during the course of the morning. But that seems to be a sentiment that is echoed, just in South African society. How do we retain the things that are going to bring us a benefit from an infrastructural, or that support infrastructure development and growth in our country, and those that simply do not? So let's go back then to our panelists. And if you're just joining us, we've got David Warnaker, Chiedza Madzima, we've got Busi Mavuso, and we have Kevin Lings who are on our panel. And if you are surprised, and you again late to the party, that they're all sitting next to each other, they are all in their own environment, and this is a completely 100% COVID-friendly panel that we've assembled for you today. All right, so let's get then into some of the other areas for discussion. And I think, Busi, I want to come back. I want to come back to you just on some of, as business leaders in South Africa. I mean, we've seen a number of great good news stories, different investments, Toyota, Ford, in these specialized economic zones. We're hoping that it's going to be a pipeline for skills transfer. We're hoping that it's also going to create a good signal for others who might have existing interests and investments in South Africa to hold on to those, but also to send the word to others that actually South Africa is a great place to invest in. And if you can just focus on that area for a little bit, talk to us about business sentiment, some of the conversations that you are having with people about South Africa as an investment destination. And as I was mentioning with DG Donda Mohanjani this morning, there's a lot we can do in making the regulatory environment. I mean, it's one thing to talk about pandemics, but making the regulatory environment friendly for investment is another.
Absolutely. And I think the business sentiment, although it has been high for quite some time, but I think let's agree, man, that I think in the previous probably maybe 12 to 18 months has definitely been low. And I think the reason for that is that we continue advocating for the same things. We continue having the same conversations with government, in terms of how to create a conducive environment where business can thrive. And I think really our one ask, from a business perspective has really been the issue of structural reforms. And we haven't seen a lot of movement in as far as this is concerned. And I must say that the momentum from the government perspective definitely is picking up at the moment. I think government finally sees, that central to the economic recovery of this country is the issue of structural reforms. But I guess I worry if it isn't a little too late, especially after we've seen, a few companies announcing the fact that they are either cancelling their investment, or they are either delaying it, or they are actually either redirecting it. So let's agree that South Africa has lost its positioning as the investment destination in the African continent. Because remember, the interest in South Africa, from an investment perspective, is to the extent that it can actually provide the gateway to the African continent, because the interest of business and of investors in South Africa is in as far as it can actually give access to the 1.5 billion people that are actually available in the continent, as it were. So government still has not done enough, in my view, from a policy reform perspective. We are just not moving fast enough, and I think we pay lip service to what we can do, in partnership with the private sector. We pay lip service to crowding in the private sector. We pay lip service to actually the issue of PPPs. But when you look at it, Iman, you will see that there hasn't been a single PPP that has been registered with a PPP unit since 2017. And this is actually concerning, because it seems as if government still thinks that the job creation agenda in this country, or the job creation crisis, can actually be solved by government. You spoke earlier on about the 12 billion rands that the minister spoke about in creation of 700,000 jobs. Well, our pockets as government in this country are not deep enough to can actually create employment. 80% of jobs in this country are actually created by the private sector. That is why the issue of business sentiment is critical. That is why the issue of, business confidence is critical, because only by having, positive sentiment and business confidence, you can therefore get economic growth. And from economic growth, you can therefore, or rather you can have investment. And from investment, you can get economic growth. And from economic growth, you can therefore, get to solve the job crisis that we're facing in this country. But for whatever reason, that message has not really landed with government. The issue of infrastructure spending, for instance, and this just shows you how much government is struggling, in terms of ensuring that they can actually, provide the required capital. We saw the revision down, of infrastructure, as the minister was actually saying yesterday, I think to 15% for next year. And we saw, that during this particular fiscal year, there's been 70 billion that has not been spent in terms of infrastructure spending. And this is all signaling the struggles, that are actually present in the government finances. So for me, this is a strong case for actually bringing in the private sector. This is a strong case for actually looking at how you actually bring in, that constituency that has got the balance sheet to can actually revive the economic growth in this country. But it's not happening to the extent that we'd like to see it happen. And I think the frustration of the private sector, Iman, is precisely that. Why is government not bringing in the private sector meaningfully, and why are they not actually leveraging the skills, the balance sheet, the expertise that only the private sector in this country can provide? And I think that issue remains elusive.
Would you concur with that, Kevin? I mean, you're virtually sitting next to Busisiwe.
Amen. I would 100% concur with that. It was very well stated. Government seems intent on trying to remain in control of everything, and the regulation remains extreme. The involvement in failing SOEs is untenable. Government is just not turning enough to the private sector. And I guess that is an ideology perspective to some extent, and I can understand that. But if we want success, we're going to have to involve the private sector much more fully in this economy and find a way to deregulate and free them up to do what the private sector is good at doing. Now, I think the government talks about private-public partnerships, and if you look at the independent power producers, it's at least a step in the right direction. But if we're going to make a difference in this country within a reasonable period of time, we've got to embrace the private sector way more fully than we're doing at the moment. Government's got to get out the way. Government is too much in the way of pretty much every in this economy. And I think that if government had the faith in that and it was willing to step away, it would be surprised at the outcome. And from a political perspective, it would benefit government, because suddenly you would have private sector investment, you would have job creation, you would have much better tax collection, and therefore government would have more scope to implement the type of social programs they really want to do. I think it's about government taking that leap of faith and trusting that the private sector will actually benefit this economy if they allow them.
Chietsa, so bearing in mind what the two previous panelists have said about this closed door approach, it would appear that government has when it comes to the private sector. Of course, there are pockets in our, in our country who would wag a figure and say that that's absolutely not true. That government is playing that open door role in terms of, making business and creating those partnerships in a meaningful way. But as they've both pointed out, the numbers don't seem to bear that out. That's what Busi was sharing with us. So where then and how then does government optimize this opportunity that Kevin Ling says is open and available on a silver platter?
Echo what the previous speakers have said. It really does depend on faster and stronger implementation of structural reforms geared towards, boosting investment in bankable infra projects, as well as boosting job creation, but using the private sector as a key vehicle and not necessarily the, sort of public sector. And, while from the budget and recent sort of longer term economic plans, there have been commitments to boost fiscal consolidation. They are quite considerable execution risks, and really what investors are looking at is a pragmatic and clear path towards fiscal consolidation, a clear plan for state-owned enterprises, and we didn't really get much clarity from the budget speech itself. But I must say, on the policy front, again, as said by previous, there are considerable improvements, or at least emphasis on using public-private partnerships as a vehicle for improving the country's infrastructure profile, as well as reforms geared towards boosting the ease of doing business when you're Operation Vulindlela, boosting ICT as the energy sector. But I think what investors will really be looking at is the degree to which government can make good on its commitments to make savings from the public sector wage bill to the tune of around 300 billion. And just on that, I think what is really lacking is a sense of urgency. And it's important to realize that this is not a single year crisis. The pandemic actually struck the South African economy at a time when it itself had underlying pre-existing health conditions. For example, when you look at growth, again, we at Fitch Solutions do not believe that the country will achieve the economic growth targets set out. In fact, over the past decade leading up to 2019, economic growth was hobbling at an average of 1.7% each year. In fact, 2010 was the last time we saw growth reach 3%. And at the same time, when you look at total government debt in US dollar terms, it has virtually doubled over the past 10 years. And of course, as mentioned before, we have 11.1 million people that are unemployed according to the expanded definition. So just putting all of this, when you also look at the significant distortions that we've seen in the labor market, there have to be much more targeted interventions, again, addressing the key long-term structural risk areas that I spoke of earlier. When you look at the energy sector, when you look at reforming labor market regulations, as well as public procurement, and so sort of reforming the public sector to help the country at least achieve stronger fiscal consolidation, so sort of shore up expenditure rather.
And that's what I'm wondering, David, as this question comes to you, about all these competing demands. It reminds me of these blankets my granny used to knit together as a child that had like several different colors in them. But you had to knit them into a coherent, beautifully designed piece that was also functional. And so you have, in a similar way, these competing demands in our economy. How do you create a hierarchy of needs against a backdrop where there is a great deal of distrust by South Africans in a context of corruption, that money will A, either be correctly allocated and be used for the purpose for which it was designed? Some would say a positive sentiment was the fact that, barring the land bank, which got 7 billion over the next 3 years, the other SOEs, the money that was given to them had already been factored in a previous budget, so they were left without.
That's a very difficult question to prioritize it, but I do think that that what we really need more than anything else is to get growth going in the economy. That's got to be our number one priority. And so, expenditure follows what the revenue can be ultimately. So we haven't got the capacity to raise revenue because we've got a small base of taxpayers. So to have the money to spend, you've got to be able to collect the money from somewhere. So we've got to broaden the base, which I think there was a move in the right direction. But I think ultimately as well, to get economic growth going, investors need the confidence to invest. So what they're looking for is policy certainty in a whole lot of areas. I think the factionalism within the ANC doesn't help the situation at the moment. But I think, as has been stated, Chiedza mentioned it earlier as well, as the inflexibility of the labour laws certainly don't help matters at the moment. The state of state-owned enterprises, land rights are another issue that creates uncertainty, nervousness amongst investors. All of these things need to be looked at. And with regard to state-owned enterprises, I think it would be I think it would be great if we could actually at some point have a cost-benefit analysis to see which state-owned enterprises are actually adding meaningful value, both from an economic point of view and a social point of view. And there should be, as Kevin said, and as Busi said, there should be more of a, involvement of the private sector in our economy. That definitely needs to happen, and it needs to happen very urgently because we need to get the growth going as rapidly as possible. So to answer your question, Iman, I think the spending priorities are difficult. I think one always wants to see more spent in education, but there too, it's people feel sometimes it seems to be a bit like a bottomless pit in the sense that there's a large teacher absenteeism rate, which I understand is roughly about 10% on average, which is totally unacceptable. And the question is whether that education is giving the skills that the economy really needs. So, but in order to get the money, we need to first raise the money, and for that we need growth, and growth has got to be our number one priority. And we can't over-politicize the issues around that. We just need growth from whichever quarter can come in the economy.
And I'd love some of the other panelists' thoughts on this issue as well of priority setting in a context of simultaneous competing needs. Because we can't put all our money in one thing at the neglect of the other, and this is also happening with the vaccine rollout that must proceed in the way that was designed to get the 67% immunized so that we can achieve herd immunity, go back to normal as an economy. And as was pointed out by yourselves, the way we're tracking right now doesn't seem as if that's an attainable objective. So how do we recalibrate our planning and our projections around what is expected and what is also unexpected? Let me go back to the polls, and this one was question 2. How do you think that government will budget for these vaccines, which are rolled out in the second half of the year? 145 people participated in this particular question, and 42% agreed with the idea of reducing government spending. This was interesting. 37% said broaden the corporate tax base, and 21% said reduce the government wage bill. So those are some of the reflections there on that question. Maybe we can flip over to question 3 if there is time, because we only have about 15 minutes left on our panel. Look how time flies when you're talking about matters in the national interest. Can we flip over to question 3 in the poll and just share how our participants are interacting with these? The Nugent Commission made policy recommendations to address governance failures at SARS. And one such recommendation is the establishment of at least 2 deputy commissioners. Do you believe this will address the challenges that SARS is facing? So I want to go back to the poll answer on that. Let me see if I can get it on my device to see where we were tracking on that second question around SARS. Okay, I can't find it on here, so hopefully we're going to bring it. There we go. There it is. No, that's not the question. We'll come back to that question. This is what happens when we're doing things online. But I think those are important questions because, again, as the Commissioner was saying this morning, fully convinced that this budget allocation that has been given is going to go a long way in making sure that tax revenue collection is streamlined. And, of course, the bigger issue is us broadening our existing tax base. So there you have it up. There's the question. Do you believe that having this is going to address the challenges that SARS faces? And 60% said no, while 40% said yes, and 153 of you interacted with this question. I'll save the fourth question for last, but I want to come back to our panel. You know, it's so important that we do adopt this sort of pragmatic approach to how we appraise the direction in which the finance minister is going, but we cannot ignore how different sectors of the South African population and corporations like yourselves or the ones you represent are interacting with this. So I want to move to a territory that says, even in this context of competing interests, and David, you also referenced competing political interests, which are going to have a major impact on, again, on our ability to function coherently and quickly. What are some of the immediate gains in this economy? The regulatory framework, policy direction setting, notwithstanding, where are some of the low-hanging fruit in this economy? I know the job creation obviously is going to be one of the #1 areas, but how do we do that? Because it needs to be backed up with something. And maybe just to reflect on that as we move into this territory of what it is that capacitates the South African economy to at least have a fighting chance of attaining that 3.3% GDP growth by the end of this financial year. And I think let's kick it off with you, Kevin.
Sure, thanks, Iman. Well, from my perspective, the most obvious is just a greater use of private-public partnerships. This economy is screaming out for that. The private sector actually has a balance sheet that is reasonably strong. Certainly, pension funds have money they're willing to deploy into infrastructure for the right infrastructure projects. We know the corporate sector balance sheet is in reasonable shape given COVID-19. And government doesn't have the finances to devote towards things like infrastructure. So to me, the obvious to really get this economy going is to find a way to partner more fully between government and the private sector. And obviously this has been mentioned, etc., but it hasn't really gained significant momentum. And I think once you start that process, it'll lift confidence and it'll get people a lot more encouraged. And perhaps we need to just stop and look back at the Soccer World Cup and have a look at how we were able to deliver that World Cup very effectively. And we've got to learn lessons from that. And I think that if we look back at that and place the same urgency we had when we were trying to meet those deadlines onto South Africa's infrastructure development now, I think we can make headway. The money is available. Internationally, the money is available. It's about implementation. And it doesn't mean you've got to implement every project simultaneously. Just start somewhere, make progress, and tell people about the progress, and systematically the confidence will follow. So I actually believe that within a matter of months, you can start to make a visible difference and brag about it. Tell everybody about what you're doing. And then I think we can start to move in the right direction. So to me, that's the obvious gap right now.
Kevin Lings, they're preaching the gospel of belief. Are you anointed, Chiedza? Do you believe?
Yes. And, well, contingent again on appropriate reform measures. I think we have to keep sight of the fact that the onus is not only on government to reform. I think the private sector also needs to focus on building back better, and government and the private sector need each other. No one party can go at it alone. But in that context, I think the longer term or the medium term picture for South Africa with adequate reform implementation is quite positive. There's a lot to like about the South African market, very deep capital markets, very sophisticated services sector and growth in e-commerce. So I think it will take reforms to kind of unlock that dynamism we see in the private sector. And again, feeding into what Kevin has said, when you look at infrastructure development, risk sharing through PPPs will really significantly benefit the economy, especially when we look at our key projects database. South Africa has about 324 projects in the pipeline, with the majority in transport and sort of energy and other utilities. So that's really positive for the medium to long-term picture. At the same time, we have to also look towards the wider continental market. When you look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that could yield considerable benefits for South Africa, especially given its diversified economic base. A lot of industries could find new markets, and there's a lot of trade complementarity in that regard. And also when you're looking at sort of your advanced services and manufacturing sector, we've seen a lot of traction in the autos space, and South Africa is definitely the sort of autos hub in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are opportunities to accelerate trade in the auto sector with South Africa sort of launch pad. And then sort of finally, again, on energy, in our green hydrogen suitability index, South Africa ranks #1 across sub-Saharan Africa on a global scale, 42nd. That's pretty good when you look at the kind of potential that we have in the space of energy. And also, again, when you look at regional gas developments, not only in Mozambique, but also sort of domestic gas reserves and being able to unlock those. So really, the future hinges on unlocking energy, unlocking private sector dynamism, of course, unlocking trade with the wider continent.
And I think that's great because on the one hand, I mean, like we always say, you know, you can't get anywhere unless the architecture is set for us to be able to arrive there or to build something. You know, the African Free Trade area came into being on the 1st of January. We know there were some obstacles, obviously, through COVID-19 that are standing in the way of us fully enacting and beginning to build everything that it can be in terms of an economic dividend and intra-Africa trade and development. But in conversations with the African Union Development Bank, we have so much baseline work to do just around making things and projects feasible, getting them to bankable states. So we have our work cut out for us, not only on the continent, but some would say, Busisi, we're even in South Africa. And when you talk about, as you mentioned earlier, business playing a more prominent role and, you know, public-private partnerships really coming into shape and form, again, what are the easiest ways that we can achieve that so that we can build capacity in South Africa and then make that big foray into the continent as is envisaged by the African Free Trade Area?
You know, if you, for instance, look at what are some of the low-hanging fruit, Iman, as you've just asked the question, I think Chairs started speaking to it around energy security. And I absolutely agree with Kevin as well around PPPs. But I think if you speak to the private sector in this country, Iman, they will tell you that they've got capacity to can actually solve the energy crisis in this country within the next 18 months. So it therefore goes to show, you know, the sort of capacity, expertise and skills that this government is actually failing to leverage. And I think it still goes back to the ideology that Kevin spoke about of this government to think that central to solving the South Africans' problems, you know, has to be done by government, you know, even when they don't have the funding, the resources, you know, and the skills to do so. Iman, we are not sitting with a capable state. And I think underlying the problems of South Africa is really the fact that, you know, we have seen a skills exodus, you know, within the public sector, at least in the last 10 years, you know, of huge amounts. So we therefore don't have a government that is in a position to can actually deliver some of the things that they need to deliver. Look at the spectrum, for instance. You know, we're told November 2020, the can has been kicked further down the road. It's now March 2021. And we know, you know, based on the conversations that we've been having with the CASA, that spectrum is not actually going to be released, you know, in March 2021. There's going to be further delays. So for me, spectrum and energy security, let's lift the license exemption for self-generation, you know, to can allow the private sector to can actually generate electricity. Because when you speak to the private sector in this country, they will tell you, you know, that they are in a position to can actually self-generate, and so much so that they can generate excess electricity to can actually be fed into the grid. And remember, the issue of energy security, man, is very critical, because this is what is dissuading investors, not just foreign direct investors, but local investors as well. It doesn't make business sense to be sitting in a country where for 18 hours a day, depending on which municipality you're sitting at, you're actually going to experience load shedding. And remember, a lot of these companies are actually multinationals. So they are not just competing locally, they're actually competing, you know, internationally. So what does that do to the competitiveness case, you know, of businesses? What does that do to the investment allocation discussion, you know, that they actually have to have with their principals sitting all the way in Germany or whatever the case is? There is no way, you know, that their principals in Germany are going to understand that South Africa as a country is failing to solve their own internal problems, you know, when they are going to continue to allocate to the capital. That is why, you know, investment and capital that is initially supposed to be coming to South Africa is going to Kenya, Rwanda. And when you look at these economies, really, they are less sophisticated and they are less advanced than the South African economy. So let's agree that where we are as a country is as a function of scoring of own goals. But I guess David raised a very important issue as well, Iman, to say that, you know, you're sitting with an ANC that is currently self-mutilating. You're sitting with an ANC that is just refusing to provide leadership. You're sitting with an ANC, you know, that seems to think that, you know, they're only responsible, or they only have to worry about the million ANC card-carrying members, versus the 59 million South Africans that they actually have to service. And I think that lack of coherent direction, the fact that the ANC is pulling in all different directions, therefore means, our policy reform case is made that much more difficult. And unless and until we can solve for the issue of leadership in this country, because let's agree that we don't have the right leadership until unless you can solve for the issue of leadership, until unless you can have a president which says that he's not going to put the ANC first, but rather South Africa Inc. first, then you're not going to achieve some of the things that we're talking about on this panel today.
So we have heard a lot, we have discussed a lot. There are many perspectives on both the finance minister's budget yesterday, but also the prospects for growth in this economy, notwithstanding all the chaos and the crises that we face every day, just in terms of what's happened with the pandemic, our rollout program, but also the obstacles to creating a free flow of business and business partnerships and cooperation. I want to go to some of our questions now as we sort of hunker down and prepare to enter the final straight. And some of the questions I think have already been answered. Some of them are comments. Let me just start with one or two of those, and I will direct them to particular panel members. However, if any of our panelists feel that they would like to weigh in on some of those questions, you are more than welcome to do so. How can we, and right at the top of the bar, how can we as individuals and industry leaders help to grow South Africa's fiscus? I think we've touched on it. We've touched on this question a little bit, but David, maybe we can zoom in again with a little more focus on what individuals and industry leaders can do in this regard.
Well, I think business has got to operate within an environment of policy certainty. So I think that one can't get away from the government's responsibility insofar as creating that enabling environment is concerned. I think from a business perspective, it's very important to realize that when it comes to corruption, which is obviously one of the big drawbacks from when one looks at South Africa from an international investment destination perspective, there are always two parties to that. So I think business must put in, and many of them have, ways to protect whistleblowers and not participate in corrupt activities. Business must pay their correct, fair share of tax. All businesses should do that. And I'd also just want to mention, I think, in terms of just our discussion on economic growth, I think the SMME sector is going to be a very, very important sector going forward, and I don't know that enough is being done to engender a culture of entrepreneurship, to encourage that in the South African economy. Last year there was an announcement of a loan scheme for small and medium businesses at a very preferential loan rates. It's not clear to what extent that has been rolled out, but I think the right skills need to be in place. It speaks to education and the right skills. SMMEs must be also a focus area in terms of enabling them to get going, with regard to business.
Kevin, maybe if I can throw this one to you, and it's been asked by more than one participant around downgrades. Are ratings agencies still looking at downgrading South Africa further than they already have? What's your expectation?
Look, many of the rating agencies have us still on a negative outlook. Certainly Moody's does. And so it remains that risk that we could see a downgrade. I think the latest budget, though, does go some way to ease those concerns, particularly the overall level of debt. If you go back to October last year, the minister said that government debt would top out at 95% of GDP. Now he's saying more 89%. 89 is still substantial, but a lot better than what was presented back in October. The fact that government has stuck to its intention to be disciplined on salaries, the rating agencies will like that. The fact that government is reducing its borrowing requirement going forward, that is positive. So I think for the moment, rating agencies will adopt more of a wait and see approach. And really what they're waiting to see is implementation. It's all about implementation. Can you actually deliver on some of these objectives? Can you get the growth going? Can you raise the tax base? And if we do some of these things, then I think the risk on a further rating downgrade will start to dissipate. But it is about implementation. And, as much as we like the budget, as much as there is praise around what the minister did, we recognize that there's lots of risks ahead with regards to his ability to make this real, to make this effective. So I think a wait-and-see approach from the rating agencies in the medium term.
I mean, corruption is also there in the mix, and we know that a lot of the way ratings agencies make their assessments is on the initial question that we were actually asking around the sentiment and the mood. If South Africa was a mood ring, I mean, would it be reflecting a color that is warm and attractive to investment? There are so many questions coming in, and my only fear is we're obviously not going to get to all of them. So I know, as with the clarity sessions past, BDO will ensure that there is some engagement on these questions and some feedback to those who are asking them. But let me go to Boitumelo's one, and Chietza, this one can be for you. You touched on an important point of government wanting to control most sectors where they have limited expertise, with construction and infrastructure sector being high on the list. How can this be addressed, as this is what is stifling growth, causing unemployment, and needs urgent attention?
I think, as previously mentioned, and of course as outlined in the budget speech, the focus really should be on mobilizing infrastructure investment through public-private partnerships. I think this is the model that a lot of emerging markets are taking on, and that could really benefit the South African economy over the longer term. I think also, in light of that, there have to be sort of efforts towards, again, liberalizing labor market regulations. As we are finding, this is becoming quite a considerable risk, even for the government itself, in terms of sort of reducing its public sector wage bill, be it with Eskom. When you look at SAA, a lot of these matters are still in court and putting quite considerable pressure on the country's fiscal health, as well as sort of economic growth potential. But as things stand, with stronger efforts towards implementing the right sort of policy, we at Fitch Solutions do believe that South Africa will likely remain on a low growth trend, and investors will likely adopt a wait-and-see approach. And there's a lot of competition, sort of globally, when you look at the sort of hunt for capital, are taking a closer look at those markets that are implementing reforms that do have slightly stronger macroeconomic fundamentals. So I think we have to be aware that South Africa is not operating in a vacuum. We cannot make policies in a vacuum, and we always be cognizant of the wider global macroeconomic picture, as well as where investors are shift the gaze.
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying, we're likely not in the firing line anytime just yet.
Contingent on reforms, yes.
Well, talking about reform, I mean, Dineo raises, the issue around which I think a lot of South Africans can coalesce, that there needs to be a big whip applied where corruption rears its head. And Dineo says corruption is a hindrance on service delivery on everything, and a pandemic, and accounts for a number of the, I'm just going to paraphrase, the misdirection of funds. How is business assisting with dealing with this, and how can the ordinary person have faith that this will be tackled? Did the minister tackle this? Did he address it? How could he have addressed it yesterday? And Busi, I suspect this might be a question you'd relish.
Yep, absolutely. So I think the minister, did talk about an allocation of about 1.8 billion, if I'm not mistaken, Iman, allocated to the Department of Justice. And I think from a business perspective, there have been efforts of working with the SARS, working with an NPA, working with, the Zondo Commission to see how we can actually accelerate their performance, and to see how we can actually capacitate them, so that then we can start seeing you know, some of these cases really taken to their logical conclusion, because I think that will do a lot, you know, from a confidence perspective. And I think let's remember that when we talk about corruption, this is not just, you know, a government issue. You know, this is a scourge that actually exists in private sector as well, because I don't think that the state capture project would have been to the extent that it was had private sector not been complicit. You know, we know about the Steinhoff case, you know, we know about the Tongat case, you know, we know about so many cases, you know, that have actually come up from the private sector. We know about the KPMG case, you know, where you have had a lot of these private sector companies that aided and abated state capture. So I think the conversation, therefore, that needs to be held and continue to be held, you know, within the business circles, is to say, to what extent do we ensure that our house is going to be clean from a private sector perspective, you know, because unless and until we can actually do that, you know, then I guess the issue of corruption really is not going to go away anytime soon. But I guess also, just from a broader civil society perspective, you know, Iman, we're going to have a conversation around the moral degeneration that we're actually facing as a country. Because remember, before we are business leaders, before we are politicians, before we are anything else, you know, we are Joe Publics, you know, we are a family unit, you know, so there has to be conversations that have to happen, you know, at that elementary structure, you know, to say, what is it that we're doing wrong, you know, to have gotten our moral conduct so wrong, you know, or what has led to the moral degeneration. And I don't know to what extent are we having the ethics conversation, you know, as often as we should. You know, David raised the point around what is private sector doing, for instance, around the protection of whistleblowers. Because if you don't protect those people, then they are not going to come forward. And we know of a lot of cases where a lot of people will tell you that as soon as I reported corruption within my organization, then I became victimized, and people are dissuaded, therefore, from actually reporting this. So the private sector does have a huge role to play in as far as this is concerned.
Well, collegiality aside, David, I mean, you know, Busi is talking there about this latest development around KPMG being sued over VBS. I think it's around 863 million or so. You know, some would say that when we talk about leadership, when we talk about partnership, and we're asking for a certain, you know, treatment as the corporate sector, as you know, private companies, that we have to lead, and those companies have to lead from the front.
Yes, absolutely, and you know, SAICA, for example, does have very strong disciplinary processes in place, fortunately. So people are being brought to book on that, and I think it's very important that those you know, that is becomes known in the general public. Yeah, it's very unfortunate. You know, it's one of these things where certainly I am of the view that it's you know, it's a very small minority, for example, of auditors that have been complicit in those type of scandals, but it's had the unfortunate consequence that the whole profession has, to an extent, become tainted, you know, in South Africa, and it's going to be difficult to win back the of the general public in that. But it's very important, because obviously one does need a very competent and a very ethical audit profession. It's very important for the whole economy and for confidence in the financial statements of all the companies.
I think as we round up this conversation, I just want to thank everyone who's participated in the Q&A, and I see so many questions. And what this leads me to believe is, A, that the interest is high on the issue of trying to create clarity in this very sort of muddy context that we can be in sometimes as South Africa and our South African economy. And I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to all of those questions this morning, but really do want to appreciate you for posting them, because they help us build a really interesting and important diverse composite view of the kinds of conversation pieces that we need to have in future. And I know that as in discussions past, there will be an attempt made to at least respond to some of those. So thank you very much for that. And as we round the corner, I want to come to each of our panelists and maybe just encourage you to make a 1 minute, you've all been on radio and television, so you know what I'm talking about, a 1 minute closing statement that really is you know, an assistance to all of those who are participating about how we can better pursue clarity? What are some of the tools that you in your professions use to pursue clarity when it seems as if, you know, nothing is going according to plan? All our algorithms and our trend setting has failed, and we are in an entirely new context. And before I get our panelists to do that, I would like for all of you who are participating to answer the following question. Did the clarity session help to bring clarity to you as a South African on critical matters in the business landscape at the moment? Yes, not really, yes, yes. So you have, you know, 4 options to choose from. But I think it's important, and even if you didn't get clarity, I don't think that it's got anything to do with the panelists per se, but these are really, you know, these are subjects that keep us entangled and in knots every single day as we try to make decisions, and credible decisions that not only take our businesses forward, but take our country forward. And so the tools for clarity, Chiedza, I would love to start with you. We'll work our way down the panel, and David, you will have the final word. Chiedza, you go ahead.
Great, thank you. I think looking ahead for government, and especially for businesses, you know, the future will be green. The focus will be based on agility, operational resilience, sustainability. So sort of from the perspective of foreign investors and local investors as well, I think there is a need for the government making good on the commitments that they have put forward. The targets are broadly in line with what we expected, and the real challenge here now will be implementation when you consider political and social, economic challenges that the country is facing.
Kevin?
Iman, I would make 2 key points quickly, mindful of your in 1 minute comment. The first key point is that have a look when you can at what's called the Open Budget Index. And in terms of that index, South Africa is ranked number 1 in the world in terms of the transparency of our budgeting process. In other words, we provide a huge amount of detail to the population about how government intends to allocate our tax revenue. We were able to have this conversation in countries. Information is not available. So the fact that we know as much as we do, I think it has to be very heartening, and there's more and more information that government is providing. The second point I would make is that the outcome of this budget could have been a lot worse. Imagine if we'd be sitting here talking about tax increases, about government not adhering to fiscal discipline, about government not being mindful of the total debt and credit ratings. It would be a completely different discussion. So I come back to what I said at the beginning. I think the minister did well with what he was working with. I think it was a good initiative overall. And now it's about implementation and trying to systematically improve South Africa's economic direction. So I've become more positive, certainly as a result of this budget.
And Busisiwe?
Thank you very much, Iman. So probably maybe let me start by attempting to talk to a question that someone posed earlier on around what I think is the biggest risk that this budget poses. I really think that the forecasted, real GDP growth, I think Kevin and I obviously don't agree on this, of 3.3% is really elusive. I think when you're looking at the 43% unemployment that is currently upon us as a country, and I worry about the projected declining revenues as a percentage of GDP that the minister spoke about. So without the implementation of structural reforms, without, the support of the Operation Vulindlela process, without the crowding in of the private sector to can actually accelerate, the implementation of the policy reforms, then unfortunately, all those numbers that the minister threw out, as forecasts are actually not going to be achieved. And maybe to touch on the clarity question in terms of what is it that one does from their own personal space to actually deal or try and usher in the clarity, I really think, Iman, that communication is key. And I think from a private sector perspective, we continue to engage with government, we continue to actually offer our skills, expertise, to can actually see how we can accelerate some of the things that we need to accelerate. And I think the second one around clarity is really how do you actually get the other party to buy in, because we are definitely not going to move the dial and make some of the shifts that we need to make in this country, especially if there isn't buy-in, from all the constituencies. And I think it's definitely really important to continue reminding ourselves, of the imminent risk that is upon us, as a country, if we don't actually achieve what we need to achieve. So I think as long as there is clarity around those three things, then I think we can definitely move the dial. And if I may just say, Iman, that the imminent risk that actually faces South Africa, if the clarity is not achieved, is that South Africa is going to be another failed African state very soon if there is no implementation and no clarity. Thank you very much, Iman.
Let's hope we never get there. David, you get the final word.
Okay. In respect of clarity, I think one achieves clarity, generally speaking, when you stand back and you break a problem down into its simplest components. And when it comes to the budget, it's really about two things. On the one side, you've got revenue, and on the other side, you've got expenditure. In this budget, there wasn't really a capacity to raise revenue because of the state of the economy. And maybe one can do that in the future if the tax gap is bridged, hopefully. When it comes to expenditure, therefore the focus had to be on limiting expenditure. And it's very pleasing to see that the public sector wage bill is, in terms of the budget at least, meant to come down, or at least the increases aren't going to be there in the forthcoming years. And that's very important because one must appreciate that R1, for example, that is misspent or wastefully spent in terms of, for example, a bloated public sector wage bill, is a rand taken away from private enterprise where that could have been invested in growing the economy, or it could have been used by the government for something more productive. So it's vitally important that that does happen. And I just hope that the assumptions on which the budget rests, in other words, being able to achieve that economic growth that they are claiming 3.3% for the coming year, and being able to implement those wage freezes actually does materialize. That is absolutely critical. But from a tax point of view, I was quite pleased with the outcome in terms of no increases in taxes. I think it's absolutely the right thing at the moment.
Thank you so much on behalf of BDO to all of our panelists and to all of you participating today. It was a great turnout. It's lovely to see some of your great feedback in the comment section, and keep it real, because it always does allow the future conversations in this format to be sharper, to be tailored and customized even better than it already is. So thank you very much for those useful comments. And once more, Chietsa Madzima, Kevin Lings, Busisiwe Mavuso, and Professor David Wanaka, it's been a pleasure being in conversation with you today. And wherever you're joining us from, I wish you well. Keep safe, keep healthy. Until the next one, thank you very much for joining us. I would also just like to remind you about our survey, and you can continue to participate with that. And we will have those results, of course, through to BDO. It's really helpful to us. So thank you so much for that. For one last time, I'm Iman Rapeti, and it's been great being your MC and moderator today.
Let's be clear. Let's say it right and do it right. Let's cut through the noise, say what we mean, and act like we mean it. Clarity isn't the opposite of complexity. Clarity doesn't mean there's only one answer. Clarity isn't a shortcut. Instead, it's a process, a refining of all our thinking and doing, until all that's left is the clearest articulation of who we are and how we work. Clarity is our line in the sand, our non-negotiable, and our clear way forward. Let's be clear.